most of this discussion has focused on capital markets and exchanges, which one might expect thinking about Hong Kong. And the next panel, we will talk about the influence of Hong Kong on China. But since we have such depth here on the economics and capital markets, I wonder if I might start us off by a question to invite this panel to comment a little bit on how you think Hong Kong will influence the evolution of capital markets and the regulatory frameworks around capital markets in China. Because now Hong Kong has a lot of experience and, high listing standards and sophisticated banking institutions and Chinese banks, mainland banks operating in the Hong Kong environment. So I wonder if you would share a few perspectives on how you think the influence in capital markets and regulatory frameworks is occurring, and whether that's also an area of an opportunity, if you will, for Hong Kong, or it's one that retains a competitive element where the mainland is trying to be an equally attractive listing venue over time, et cetera. Who would like to offer any thoughts?
Happy. Just a very short. I think when we talk about Hong Kong setting regulatory standards are not really set by regulators. Regulators try to moderate what the input from market participants in forming those rules and those regulations. In Hong Kong, in part because of our history, in part of which has really developed the relevant market participants in Hong Kong are actually primarily today international global participants. There's nothing particularly indigenous in the players participant. That is Hong Kong. They are the global players. They had not been so in the stock exchange when we started, but and they continue to have make noises. But on the whole, the way it is developing is the global. So what I think the standards that are being developed in Hong Kong would really be how to moderate global standards with a Chinese setting of the market.
Okay, thank you.
So one thought, obviously, one of the things I mentioned in my presentation is the pilot schemes that are used in Hong Kong. I used the example of the RMB settlement, trade settlement schemes, but there's many other initiatives that have been in a way piloted in Hong Kong that will obviously influence the mainland. And if we go back to the 1st of July of 1997, actually, there was a view that from a financial center perspective, actually, the future of Hong Kong might not be a bright future after all, and actually, many people share the view. And today, I think there's a much less binary view of, let's say, for instance, Shanghai versus Hong Kong, which is obviously an interesting debate. But if we take the US, which is the other very large global economy, clearly New York is a very large domestic financial center. Obviously, it's a very important international financial center, but actually thrives on being attached to the largest economy in the world. But equally, Chicago is a very important center, and there's many other cities. Equally today, we look at Tianjin, we look at Chongqing, we look at Shenzhen itself, we look at Hong Kong, we look at Shanghai. There is clearly less of this binary idea that's either one or the other. Yes. And I think a lot of the experience of Hong Kong will continue to influence the mainland's sort of development in terms of financial institutions. We have 190 odd banks in Hong Kong. It's a fiercely competitive financial system. I think that in itself also acts as an escape valve for some of the tensions that exist either in the financial markets or in the currency markets in the mainland. And Hong Kong can actually perform that role. So I think my reflection is that Hong Kong can continue to play that role. And we've shown that even over the last 2 or 3 years, that even the new sort of initiatives are accelerating that development in a way that would be impossible to do, let's say, in Shanghai, because you'd need to really liberalize the entire financial system at the same time, and that simply might disrupt too much of the mainland Chinese economy. So I think Hong Kong can continue to be that, for lack of a better word, lab for some of the development that then ends up being rolled out across mainland China.
Thank you.
I mentioned earlier, obviously, you've detected my enthusiasm for Hong Kong. To this very good question, I think the world is looking at the regulatory standards in general. The U.S. obviously has some issues in Europe. But clearly China, in a sense, is starting with a fresher slate. Hong Kong, we have a lot of challenges here, I think, in the regulatory environment. So even though I think it's very good, and I think it has and will play an important role in China, it's very, very, it is a challenge. I don't think the regulatory environment here is perfect. I think there are some challenges there. But I think, as I mentioned, I think it's, if you look at Hong Kong, I mentioned the lawyers. Lawyers have expanded dramatically. The accountants are very good. It's a perfect business for Hong Kong. It's a perfect opportunity for Hong Kong to work with China. Also, I think on the investors, we have an increasing number of experienced investors from all over who are providing increased liquidity. Some of the liquidity, in fact, probably a lot of it is coming from China. The opportunity for Hong Kong to manage that investment in the first stage, and also to manage the globalization, or help Chinese companies globalize and do their investments. I mean, it's a tremendous opportunity for Hong Kong. It's not going to be the only place, but clearly Shanghai, Beijing has its own unique role. Shanghai is a Shenzhen even. I mean, when we talk I think in the stock exchange, when we talk about competition from Shanghai, it's really Shanghai, Beijing, or Shanghai and Shenzhen. But yes, there's a great opportunity, and Hong Kong has those skills, and it needs to keep its edge. It can't be complacent. There are some negative factors in Hong Kong, but generally speaking, I think the positive, open, and international. And I mentioned the Hong Kong people. I mean, the great thing about Hong Kong is that it's an international center. It's easy for people to come here. It's self-selective. It's a very good tax environment. It's particularly good for Brits, not so good for Americans. So this is an advantage, but I think there's a lot of work, a lot of opportunity. If you think of the jobs that will be created by investment analysts and accountants and lawyers and administrators. Just one thing for people in the audience, in trying to get Hong Kong to allow the establishment of the actual funds, a fund in Hong Kong, as opposed to the Cayman Islands or somewhere else. And this seems to be an insurmountable task. I don't know, but that is another, having the money set up here is another area of business for administrators and bankers and again, accountants and lawyers. And I just don't know why Hong Kong can't do that, but for those of you who are involved with that. So, yeah, it's a challenge, but we have the same challenges that the rest of the world has. We need to raise the level. It's definitely not perfect.
Thank you. Yadong?
One, I'm sure, thank you. I'm sure Hong Kong has a lot to offer to mainland China in terms of its regulatory experience. But one complaint I've had, and a lot of my colleagues have had as well, is that as outsiders looking in, I do not see clear or consistent evidence that Chinese companies listed in Hong Kong or having gone through the process of being listed in Hong Kong necessarily have any better governance record. And whether it's in the process of doing an IPO with the accounts and everything, or other governance practices after it's been in Hong Kong for, in some cases, many years. Mm-hmm. And I'm just, people like you, I'm just wondering if there are things that Hong Kong can do, because, right now, as I talked about before, that Hong Kong has been the kind of equity fundraising place by choice. It's almost kind of by default as well. But once people have, choices, be it Shanghai, Hong Kong, or anywhere, if Hong Kong does not enjoy a real premium in terms of its reputation, do people necessarily still come?
Yes, please.
Could I answer? I mean, this is a subject for a whole conference, I think. But the interesting thing about corporate governance, obviously, historically, I think it's still true that most of the local Hong Kong companies with the exception of the Hong Kong Bank, are family companies. And some of them are great companies, and some people work for them in this room. Clearly, that's one challenge that Hong Kong has, which is to make those companies into Li and Feng or whatever maybe there's some that are well managed in terms of corporate governance. China has a different issue. There, I think, these are state-owned enterprises for the most part, particularly in Hong Kong. Not necessarily there's Pony Ma and Company. They're Tencent. Some of those are different, but most of them are state-owned enterprises. The problem they have, and I'll just give you an example. We had, without speaking out of school, we had a regulatory issue. A disciplinary issue, and the guy came in. It was quite a dynamic company. They were late with some, they messed up something in compliance. And so the chief executive came in, and he was very concerned about this hearing. There were 6 people from the listing committee. And the listing division had been quite tough on him. In fact, they were recommending that he not be a director and all this stuff, which is about the worst thing we could do to people on the listing. And as it turned out, the guy, we discovered in the process of our thing, the guy was actually a fantastic guy. He was a really strong entrepreneurial guy. And somehow in the setting up the company, he was the chief compliance officer, right? So this was not either she. He had no idea. I don't think he knew what compliance meant. And so obviously, because they messed up, he was the chief compliance officer. So, but what we decided was, look, he shouldn't have been the chief compliance officer. He needs to step that up. He needs to hire a couple of good people, lawyer, secretary, whatever. But he was very vital to the company, and he was a good person. He wanted to do well. He just had no idea. And this is the problem. The Hong Kong people know what they should do, but they don't want to do it. It's not all of them, but some of them. So, this is what I mentioned, the challenges. And even the Hong Kong Bank might say, for example, they don't want to do quarterly reporting because it's short-termism, or, the blackout periods. These are the issues. These are nuances. But to maintain the standards. The other problem, of course, for Hong Kong is enforcement. One of the things is you can have fantastic laws, but no enforcement. And frankly, I think enforcement is weak in Hong Kong in the different levels, if I may say, since somebody asked. So this is a challenge for us, and clearly it's a huge challenge in China. It's a huge challenge. Corruption is just the tip of the problem, but corporate governance, it's a new thing. It's a new thing in the States. But if you read the ExxonMobil annual report, you'll see how it can be developed. But we're not there yet, and this is a big challenge for China.
Just if I can add just a couple of comments. I couldn't agree more actually with the comments. I think Hong Kong has benefited from the fact that it is unique, and it has been unique for some time, and I think it will be less unique going forward, so it needs to differentiate itself more. So if we take a few examples, actually HSBC started quarterly reporting 2 weeks ago, but actually we started quarterly reporting for the first time because there was no pressure actually in Hong Kong to have quarterly reporting. Actually, there's many companies that do not report quarterly like many of the other banks. We felt that internationally we needed the transparency to report quarterly, not so much for the transparency itself, but because we think it's a good thing for ourselves, for our own share price sort of dips and troughs, because the more information you give to the markets, the more they can actually predict what's going to happen. But I think the issues with Hong Kong will come in two shapes, if you wish, in two categories. One is the competition for financial centers outside Greater China. So clearly, if we think of the mutual fund industry or the asset management industry in general, when you land in Singapore, you get a sort of hedge fund starter kit, right? And it actually, in 3 hours, you pretty much have set up everything. And a lot of the people that, like myself, moved outside of London, many of them moved to Singapore because not only the schools were better, which I think you mentioned earlier, or it was easier to get into school, not that they were better, so they got schooling for their kids, but actually it was easier from a regulatory perspective to actually set up, particularly within the asset management industry. So I think that's one of the challenges. The second challenge is that many of the international investors have invested in international companies in Hong Kong because they can. Whereas if the international board sort of gets established in Shanghai and international companies can start to list in Shanghai, there will be definitely much more of a why Shanghai versus Hong Kong. So I think there needs to be a differentiation. And also there's more conversion of the standards. So one of the good things, apart from government, is that, for instance, audit standards are very strong in Hong Kong. But one of the recent moves is that now the mainland Chinese audit companies can actually audit all of the companies that get listed here too. So that differentiation is no longer there, which is one of the things that investors actually appreciated, was the fact that somehow the audit profession was stronger here, and actually the law profession was also stronger here. So I think those are challenges going forward. Just to finish on a positive note, I think in Beijing, I think a lot of the regulators are taking the front foot in terms of regulation. We were just discussing this earlier. The CBRC has just moved to move forward the timeline for implementation of Basel III. So if you think that most of the banks have up to 2019 in a phased way to implement Basel III, and many of the regulators are still struggling exactly how to implement it. And the CBRC last week, or the week before, actually said that by January 2012, they want to align most of the Chinese regulation for the mainland Chinese banks with Basel III, and in a way sort of pushing forward that timeline, whereas the US is still not even in Basel II, if we really think about it, and many of the European countries will only implement it progressively. So I think there are also some positive developments, and the fact, as I said in the beginning, that the HKMA here is very well coordinated with the PBOC and with the CBRC, etc. I think that's a positive, but I think the differentiation will become less. There will be less of a competitive differentiation for Hong Kong going forward.
Well, thank you very much. I should note one of my extracurricular activities is chairing the NASDAQ exchange, and as in that function I chair the Regulatory Oversight Committee, and I've come to appreciate the investment not only of NASDAQ but of the U.S. exchanges in technology as playing a crucial role in regulatory oversight. And as we are increasingly in a world of electronic trading and algorithmic trading and high-frequency trading, you know that you've got to have very robust technology systems. And I've had a chance to look at systems in Japan and elsewhere, which also have some distance to go before I think they are as robust as what we are seeing in the United States and frankly in the UK as well. So this is, I think, an area of emerging and evolving capabilities around the world. Nothing here is static, but clearly Hong Kong is an important player and with embedded strengths. What a wonderful panel. I think we are out of time. If I started a question, we'd go over our allotted time, so I'll stop a moment early, but please join me in thanking this wonderful group.